Good evening. Good evening. Thank you for the great intro, and thanks to the Amazing Grace team for letting me come have this opportunity. Thank you all for coming. I gotta say, this feels a little weird. I'm up front, and there's a pastor way in the back, so that's a little different than what I'm used to. So but we'll be all right. So I'm gonna talk about DNA, and the title of my talk is DNA, the Language of God. And why do we refer to DNA as a language? Well, you're going to see that DNA contains letters. DNA contains words. DNA is really the instruction manual for all of the processes that occur within all of our cells. Okay? So that's why we call it a language. It's also an incredibly complex structure that God designed. Okay? Very complex. So before we talk about that, I want to mention maybe what we call the opposite of God creating DNA, or the alternative, which is DNA formed through a random process, accidentally, by chance. And we call that evolution. Okay? Evolution is kind of the alternative theory that's out there. It says everything came from non-life, it was an accident, and that's what caused DNA to form, and then eventually somehow that led to life. We don't know how, we've never seen it, we've never observed it, but that's the theory that so many still continue to cling to. So hopefully I can show you tonight just how non-scientific evolution is and how great are the works of the Lord. So that's my goal. So first thing I want to talk about are the odds. So I'm going to do a little demonstration. Does everybody know what this is?
Yes.
This is a padlock, right? It's a real padlock. Does everybody know how a padlock works? You have there are 40 digits, right? Numbers, options, and you have to get 3 consecutive numbers to open it, okay? So, Kevin, you get one chance.
All right.
You know how it works? You turn it right, and then you rotate it once, and turn it to the number left, and then you turn it right.
Okay, let me do all 3.
All 3 numbers.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay. One chance.
Right, then left?
Right, and then rotate it. Left.
Nope.
Okay. One more. One more attempt.
She might know that.
Setup. This is a setup.
Amazing. She got it.
Amazing.
She got it on one try. Okay. Why are we laughing right now?
That's her lock.
What, Rick?
Well, the odds are 100%.
Because it was kind of a setup, right? Yeah. I know her, and she had a little bit of information. Do you want to show them? I wrote down the combination on a piece of paper, and I gave it to her. Okay? So she had some information, and I created the information. Without me creating that information, this lock was useless to her, right? So we're going to see as we go on, just like the information on the paper, DNA is important, and it needs someone to create it, right? I gave you that combination. The odds of getting that right, just randomly, just happen to be all 3 numbers, 1 in 64,000. Okay, so that's 6.4 with 4 times 10 with 4 zeros after it. So those are the odds, not really good odds. And that's why we laughed, right? Because we knew that was a setup, right? We knew that 1 in 64,000, we'd be probably buying a lottery ticket later tonight if that were the case, right? Let's talk about some other odds. So a little later, I'm going to talk to you about proteins and what proteins are. Proteins are actually the building blocks of everything in our body. Okay, they're the building blocks of life. And the chances of one protein molecule forming in the correct sequence, with the correct shape, three-dimensionally, and being functional is 1 times 10 with 300 zeros after it. Okay? And by the way, just keep in mind that in mathematics, 1 times 10 with 50 zeros after it is thought to be 0 probability. So that's considered 0 probability. So in other words, the chances here are 0. Okay? And this is actually some data from a professor of applied mathematics and astronomy from the University of Cardiff, Wales. He notes that the likelihood of spontaneous formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 noughts after it. Okay? So those are the odds. Okay? The beginnings of life were not random. They were the product of God, as stated in Genesis. And these numbers help to support that. Okay, I'm going to first talk a little bit about some very common misconceptions that we continue to hear about and we've heard about for a while. And those are conceptions about what DNA, these are what I call things DNA doesn't prove. Things DNA does not prove. This is a picture, very close-up magnified picture, of my teenage daughter when I wake her up for school. It's not. It's a picture of Cymex lectularius, more commonly known as a bedbug. Okay, it's a bedbug. And in doing some research, I came across an article in Molecular Ecology, and this article, right up front, it states. The bedbug is right on the cusp of diverging into a new species. And it says, in New York Times, journalist wrote about this article, and he said, in bedbugs, scientists see a model of evolution, claiming the bedbug shows how Darwinian evolution works. Well, if you actually read the article, what they talk about are bedbugs. They've been around for a very long time. Even Aristotle, back in the classical period, and the author of a 3rd century BC Egyptian papyrus, they describe these pests. So they've been with us for a long time, okay? And what they studied were bat-biting bedbugs. So there are some that live on bats as their hosts. And they studied human-biting bedbugs. So if you go back far enough, humans lived in caves and other dwellings, and they were in closer proximity to bats. But then humans moved out, and they moved into dwellings and houses and cities. And some of the bedbugs went that way, right, with them, and some stayed with the bats. Well, what they found were that the bedbugs that went to the humans were changing. So they observed some different traits. They said these bedbugs have different legs, they're shorter, they're not as good at clinging on to the bats that hang upside down in the caves, because they can be lazier. They just lay in a bed, right? For the person. They also, if fed bat blood only, they die sooner. Okay? So what actually the study proved is that it's actually the opposite of evolution, right? If isolated, a certain population of bedbugs start to lose traits. Okay? They lose the ability to feed on different species. They become more isolated. They lose genetic information. Okay? So that article proved exactly opposite of what it was advertised. It didn't create a bigger and badder bedbug. It created a weaker one with less traits. So it doesn't prove evolution. Another thing DNA doesn't prove, we've probably heard reference to the fact that we have close cousins, apes, right? They're the closest to humans on the evolutionary tree, right? We hear that all the time. And we hear numbers, too. They like to use numbers and percentages and say that we're only a few percent, maybe 1 or 2% different, genetically speaking, between humans and apes. Well, the problem there is that 1.23% of the differences in our DNA between humans and apes is actually 35 million differences. Okay? 35 million differences. And also, humans have 40 million DNA base pairs. I'll talk about what those are. that aren't present in apes, and apes have 40 million base pairs that aren't present in humans. So if you add all those numbers up, 35 million differences, 40 in humans and 40 in apes, that's over 100 million differences in our DNA. Okay? So a lot of times they use the percentages and they use that to kind of skew the magnitude of the differences, right? They express it as a percentage and they shrug off the differences. But it shouldn't really be a surprise to us that many of God's creatures have similarities, right? Many of the building blocks used to create other creatures are also found in humans, okay? In fact, another thing it doesn't prove. In fact, we share 60% of our genes with a fruit fly, 75% with a mouse, 80% with a cow, and we share 50% of our DNA with bananas. So this could possibly explain why after some long and hectic days we do feel half bananas, right? Okay. So just remember that next time somebody says we're close to apes. All right. So we heard now some of the things DNA doesn't prove. What are some of the things that DNA does prove? The science shows us this, right? Omne vivum ex vivo. That's the first and probably the last time you're going to hear me speak Latin tonight. Okay? Omne vivum ex vivo. Anyone know what that?
All life from life.
All life comes from life. Very good. You got it. Correct. So DNA proves that all life comes from life. Let me reference another article that I found in doing some research here. This one was reported in Time magazine, so it must be true, right? According to them, there was the ultimate science experiment. Some scientists took a handful of chemicals, they mixed them together, and presto, life. Life. That's what the article actually said. And it said they put them into a cell, the cell booted up, and life, by nearly any definition, was created. Okay, so here's what they really did. They took, they bought some DNA. They bought about DNA that was about, I think about 100 base pairs long, and they pieced 10 of those together to make 1,000, and then 10 of those to make 10,000, and 10 of those to make 100,000, and then 11 of those to make a DNA base pair string that was over 1 million base pairs long. Then they put it into a yeast cell. And what's yeast? It's a living thing. And that's how they were able to get the cell of a bacteria to boot up and show that they could make life. So really what they proved was that life comes from life. They couldn't do it without the yeast. Okay, that's what the article showed us. Second thing DNA does prove, likes produce likes. One of the places we see the first demonstration of this is in Genesis 1, right? In fact, in Genesis 1, it's stated 7 times, verses 21, 24, and 25, that God created everything according to their kind. Okay, 7 times they stress that, according to their kind, right? So dogs were created according to their kind. Apes were created according to their kind. Fish, birds, humans. And when humans reproduce, what do they reproduce every time? Humans. When dogs reproduce, okay, it might be a little dog, might be a big dog, might be a wolf, it's still a dog, genetically speaking, right? So, like produces like. Evolution claims just the opposite of what we see. Evolution says all life came from the same kind. That's exactly what evolution says. All life came from the same kind. It's never been demonstrated, never been observed to happen before. So, I want to speak a little bit on, kind of the history here of our generation being conditioned. We've been conditioned, particularly our children in school, to feel deep reservations about the scientific accuracy of many biblical statements, right? Especially the Genesis account regarding creation, creation of the universe and of life. If we go back, 100 years or so, even to the times of Darwin in the mid-19th century, even up into the 20th century, scientists believed that they had eliminated the need for a creator. Okay? And we continue to see that today, the unquestioning acceptance and teaching of evolution in high schools, university, and media. And really that has served to weaken the faith of many Christians. And when we get a weakening faith, we also see these same children questioning the authority and truthfulness of the Word of God. Right? If we can't believe Genesis, what about the rest of the Bible? Jesus himself warned us about this. He warned us. He said, speaking of Genesis, but if ye not believe his, Moses' writings, how shall you believe my words? There is some encouraging development within the scientific community. In a 1997 survey in Nature, it was found that 40% of the top scientists believe in God. Okay, 40%. Even though about 100% of our textbooks teach evolutionists back. So I think that's an encouraging number, and I hope that, with us working with our children, that number will increase even more going forward. But we have seen many recent and tremendous advances in astronomy, physics, biology, DNA, world of nature, that have really helped add confidence within the scientific community around the accuracy of the Genesis account of God's creation of the heaven and the earth. So, one more slide around kind of the prevailing attitude out there within the community of science and academia. I call this the atheistic religion, and that's kind of, might seem like an oxymoron. Well, atheism isn't a religion, is it? Well, it actually is a religion. And the reason it's a religion is because those who adhere to that belief do it as a matter of faith, because there is no evidence to support it. Okay? So it is a religion. So why do we have this blind faith? Well, one reason is there's such a strong bias against God in the academic community. Many scientists and professors really fear that if they waver at all in their support of evolution, that they could hurt their career. And it could hurt their ability to obtain financial grants for research, right? So there's one reason why. Another reason why is, and this is a sad one, right? Many of the scientists and educators believe if they have to believe in God as our creator, then they have to accept the truth that we all have an appointment to meet our creator God as our judge following our death, right? We know we will all stand before God. The Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy 4, verses 3 and 4, warned that in the last days before Christ's return, men would purposefully deny the truth and invent fables to explain the existence of the world and humanity. So you can see that the problem isn't that people cannot believe the evidence before their eyes, it's that they will not. Okay? One of the gentlemen who discovered the structure of DNA, his name was Francis Crick, and he was a gentleman in England. James Watson was his partner. Francis Crick was a pretty smart guy, right? He knew the complexity of the DNA structure. He helped to determine it and model it. And he was smart enough to know those odds, too. Remember those odds that I showed you back at the beginning? He knew there really was no way that DNA could form itself here on Earth. And unfortunately, because of his blind faith in the atheistic religion, he actually wrote a book. He wrote a book, and in that book, he introduced a new theory. I call it a fable, but it could be called a theory too. That DNA was actually designed by intelligent life forms on a different planet, in a different galaxy. And it came to Earth, it was delivered to Earth on a starship or via solar winds. And then it came to Earth, and then somehow that's what started life. And that's actually what Professor Francis Crick believed and wrote about. Okay. Before I get into some of the details around, DNA, what does DNA do? What is its purpose? What is its structure? What is it like? I want to talk a little bit about the human body, right? So the complexity and the design of the human body. And hopefully some of what I'll show you will help remind us as we read in 1 Corinthians 12:18, but in fact God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them just as He wanted them to be. So the human body, of all the glorious things God has created, in our universe, the human body is really the most fantastic creation of all. Within the human body, there literally are thousands of interconnected systems, okay? Right? From cells on up to circulatory system, respiratory system, digestive system, musculoskeletal system, reproductive system. And really, the marvelous thing is that all of these systems are interconnected, right? Without the respiratory system, the circulatory system doesn't work right? Because we need oxygen, right? Without the circulatory system, the musculoskeletal system doesn't work right because our muscles need blood. They're separate. And again, that's the opposite of evolution when you think about it, right? Evolution says things accidentally and slowly, piece by piece, developed. And what we have here is a perfect system that existed from the first day it was created by God. And we know that's how it has to be to function. King David wrote in the Psalms about the wonders of God's creation of mankind. Let us make man in our own image, after our likeness, a crown of glory, such as thou hast given to no other creature. Man in Eden had full command of all creatures, and they came before him to receive their names. The image of God. All right. The human brain. The human brain is the most powerful computer known to science. Okay? Within the human brain, there are 10 billion nerve cells. Okay? There are, on each one of those 10 billion, 100,000 fibers connected. And that gives us 10 quintillion connections in our brain. Okay? How many people here are football fans? All right. 2. So, something we probably take for granted is when a quarterback guns a pass to a wide receiver and he catches it in stride, right? And he runs it into the end zone. We see it every Sunday, right? We see it all the time. Well, here's a little science behind that and how the brain kind of functions. In less than 1 second, your brain can calculate the trajectory of a football thrown 30 miles per hour, and it instantaneously sends detailed electronic messages to the muscles in your arms and your legs at more than 300 miles per second to move you into position to catch the football. Despite billions of dollars and 50 years of advanced research on the brain by computer scientists seeking to duplicate its function, there is no computer on earth that can equal this marvelous, instantaneous computing required to allow you to catch a football. There is no robot, right? They're all humans out there on the field, no robots yet. All right. Here's another one that I really enjoy. It's the human eye. This is one that evolutionists have a lot of trouble with, right? The human eye. And the reason is because evolution says the parts form accidentally as the result of random chance mutations. Well, you can see a lot of parts in the human eye. And guess what? Every single one of those parts needs to be there, needs to be fully formed, fully functional in order for the eye to work. So the eye didn't evolve. The eye was created in Adam and Eve. And it's been that way, okay? In the retina, you can kind of see the retina here. It's this thin yellow layer. There are 135 million cells in the paper-thin retina. They're called rods and cones. Okay? They analyze more than 1 million messages a second, and they transmit information into the brain in the form of a signal that travels approximately 300 miles per hour. When a new baby is conceived, at the moment they are conceived, what happens within the eye is optic nerves start to grow. And they grow from this side and they grow from this side. And there are 1 million optic nerves. They're programmed to grow, and they're programmed to meet each other. All 1 million of them are growing, and they all meet and connect. And it's because of the instructions of DNA that they're able to do that. Okay? They begin growing as soon as the baby is conceived, from both sides. Dr. John Stevens made the following comparison. To simulate 10 milliseconds of processing of just one single nerve cell from the retina would require several minutes of processing on a Cray supercomputer. This is a Cray supercomputer, by the way. Okay? That was one nerve cell. There are, in fact, 10 million nerve cells in your eye interacting. That would take a minimum of 100 years of Cray supercomputer time to simulate what takes place in your eye many times every second. Okay? So these computers weigh hundreds of pounds and they take up a lot of space. The retina weighs less than a gram, and it takes up 0.0003 inches of space. Okay? God's creation is indeed very good. Who's heard the saying, laughter is the best medicine? Right? We've heard that one. It's not just a saying. It's actually a proven scientific fact. And we first heard about it here in the Bible, Proverbs 17:22. A merry heart doeth good like a medicine, but a broken spirit drieth the bones. So modern psychiatry has discovered that good humor and laughter actually improves our overall health, right? During laughter, hormones and chemical endorphins greatly improve our overall sense of well-being. Okay, simple cells. Simple cells. Which one looks simple? The left or the right? Okay. The cell was discovered in about 1839, and at the time we didn't have the advanced microscopy techniques that we have today. Cells were thought to be these homogeneous globs of protoplasm, right? And one of Darwin's ardent supporters, his name was Ernst Haeckel, he suggested that if you pulled up mud from the bottom of the sea, you could produce life by itself, right? So that's kind of what Darwin thought a cell looked like too. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple, right? And then it could evolve into more complex things. Now we know cells are infinitely more complex. Here's a little more accurate picture, right? More accurate than any supercomputer that is in existence. One cell. We have 100 trillion cells in our bodies, okay? Each one is like a city. It has many individual parts, right? We all learned these when we took biology class, and what they all do. It functions like a city. There's energy generation, energy distribution. There's waste removal. There's protection against viruses and other bacterial invaders, okay? All these systems and nano machines inside the cell working together. If you take one part away, what happens? Again, the opposite of evolution, right? The parts didn't form slowly. The cell was fully developed, okay? Cells, only cells can create cells. Life comes from life. Okay, this is not a picture of a creature from the Matrix, okay? Might look like it. This is actually in our stomachs. I know. Sorry, I hope I didn't ruin anyone's appetite. This is a picture of an E. coli bacteria. It's a picture. However, you can actually go online and see an actual magnified image. This is what they look like about 30,000 times magnified under an electron microscope. Okay? They have this flagellum, and it works like a motor. They propel themselves in our intestinal waterways. There's a motor, a propeller, a fuel line, which provides acid as fuel. There's a rotor, a stator, a U-joint, a drive shaft, and it is two-speed. It can go in forward and reverse. It's water-cooled, and it is a marvel of biological engineering. So I think we all know who filed the patent on this, right? Okay, here's another kind of example of these molecular nanomachines. There are thousands of them in our cells, hundreds and thousands of them. This is a picture of a protein. It's a protein called ADP. Actually, I think it's ATP. ATP is adenine triphosphate. And this is the energy fuel that all of us are using right now. Each of our cells performs a reaction about 1 million times per minute to convert building materials into ATP, which is kind of the energy fuel of our cells. So this is a protein, and we're going to talk more about proteins, but how does this protein know how to form? How does it know the structures and the building blocks need to be in this precise sequence? And it's actually a three-dimensional network. If it's not in that specific orientation, it doesn't work. Okay, and that's where DNA comes into play. So now, finally, the part you've all been waiting for, DNA. DNA, I'll talk about what it is built of and what it stands for. But my favorite secondary definition for this acronym is definitely not by accident. That's what I say DNA stands for, right? Definitely not by accident. So DNA is the blueprint for life. Okay, and by life I mean it builds proteins and it directs proteins and it guides them to the right places and it provides the instructions that they need. So if it's a blueprint, let me ask, has anyone ever observed a blueprint that is formed accidentally or by itself? No? Okay. It's the densest information storage mechanism in the universe. So if you were to take human DNA and collect enough of it to occupy the volume of a head of a pin, okay, so a pinhead volume of DNA, the amount of information in that pinhead volume is enough to stack books from the Earth to the Moon and back 240 times. Okay, so you can see that DNA is a pretty complex and very efficient design of storage. The same goes true for compact discs. The amount of information in the pinhead equals a 68-mile high stack of compact discs full of information. Same information storage density. DNA uses a language or a code, right? So think of like Morse code, right? When I hear code, sometimes I think of Morse code. What does Morse code require? It requires somebody to send it, right? A creator, right? You don't just get a Morse code message by itself. So it requires a sender, just like God is the creator and the sender of the DNA instructions. Okay? Just like the padlock, right? Just like the padlock. The code to unlock the padlock, you've got the code, right? The code to unlock the padlock, it required a lock maker to program it into the design of the lock, right? So even if this lock were to somehow randomly form over millions of years, it would still be useless, right? It still requires a person to program the code to actually open it and operate it. DNA, let's talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of DNA. DNA has a geometrical pattern, okay? Why? Well, just like many examples in nature that God has designed, there are mathematical and geometrical patterns found throughout nature. Plants, animals, and objects. Anyone want to guess what that one is? Somebody said it. Aloe? Yep. It is an aloe plant. It's a spiral aloe, correct? What about that one?
Hens and chickens.
What was that guess?
It's a succulent. Hens and chickens.
Oh.
It's not.
It's close.
Oh, come on.
You're right, it is a plant. It's actually broccoli. It's a specific type of broccoli. And the broccoli contains a pattern called a fractal. It's a natural phenomenon. It's a mathematical set that exhibits a repeating pattern, and it displays itself at every scale. So you can see the spiral, and then you have a smaller spiral, and then you have smaller spirals on there. So it's a repeating pattern, a fractal. Sunflower, right? There's a pattern there. Anyone know what that is? That is actually a very, 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 very close-up magnified image of a wing of a morpho butterfly. Okay? It's very precise and very intricate designed. Okay? These are tiny microscopic ridges on the surface of the butterfly's wings. They create a structural pattern They're perfectly evenly spaced, and they are less than one wavelength of light apart. What does that mean? Well, a wavelength of light apart, they're basically 0.00002 millimeters apart. And what that causes is when the light hits the butterfly wing, it creates what's called an interference pattern. So the light reflects, and due to the fact that this precise spacing exists, only one particular color of light is allowed to escape that we can see. And that's what the morpho butterfly looks like, right? A dazzling blue, right? Nowhere on Earth could we create this type of precision, even with the greatest tools. God's creation is very good. Here's the geometry of DNA. So we call this the axial view. What that means, DNA has repeating units called base units. Okay, the base units are symmetrically justified in such a way that this double helix, if you were to take this and kind of turn it on its end and look at it down the end, kind of like you're looking down the barrel of a gun, you'd see what's called these repeating pentagon patterns. And this is actually kind of the pentagons. This is kind of the drawing once we start to put some of those base pairs on there. And this is an actual image, magnified, of the DNA in this axial view.
Is it even that color?
I think they may use some dyes and stuff to enhance the different colors of the different bases and amino acids. The color may be enhanced a little bit there, yeah. So, throughout the Bible, we hear statements such as, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made." We can see it. So, DNA doesn't just stand for definitely not by accident. It stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. Deoxyribonucleic acid. So the double helix are these strands. They're basically constructed of a deoxygenated sugar molecule and a phosphate backbone. Okay? And they hold the structure in place. The rungs of the ladder that you see inside are the bases. Those are the letters. Okay? There are 4 letters: A, G, T, and C. Adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. Okay? Those are called nucleotide bases. Okay? And a DNA strand can literally have 1 million or more of those. And the precise arrangement is linear and it's well ordered. So you can see that DNA can have many different codes and instructions based upon how those 4 bases are sequenced on that long string molecule. Okay? So they're specified. They're very complex. They're very well organized, and they're arranged in a very linear and hierarchical manner. The storage density of DNA is many, many times more than any advanced silicone chip. Okay? There have actually been mathematical studies that show 4 is actually the optimal number of letters to have. If you get more than that, the DNA structure has to be kind of too large for the human cell. So God also made them designed optimally to contain the right amount of information. This strengthens the argument that the case for God's design rather than any kind of fortuitous chance that this thing would come about, right? So what does DNA do? Well, it does several things. One of the key properties is it synthesizes proteins. Remember I said proteins are the building blocks for life? Okay? Every part of our body, every function within our body is controlled by proteins. So DNA is needed to form proteins, and I'm going to show you a little video of kind of how that works. In our bodies, we have about 50,000 different proteins. And these proteins are built from amino acids. The amino acids are kind of represented by the little balls here in the structure. And they have to be arranged, obviously here, in a very definite sequence for every protein. This is an example of insulin. Okay, insulin is a protein that controls blood sugar. If one of the little balls or amino acids is slightly different or not in the right position, it will render the protein non-functional. Okay, so think about the odds again that I showed you at the beginning. Remember, I showed you it was 1 times 10 followed by 300 zeros, that something like this could form by itself. DNA, as I had mentioned previously, also acts as the instruction manual, okay? The instruction manual for all of the processes that occur within the cell. A couple of the things DNA can do is, first of all, it's self-replicating. What does that mean? What does it mean, self-replicating? It means that the DNA double strand unwinds itself, and at the same time, a complementary strand is constructed on each separate one. So every time a cell divides, the DNA also divides and creates 2 duplicates with the exact same information. So eventually there are 2 new double strands identical to the original one. A couple other properties of DNA, it goes through what's called translation and transcription. I'm not going to get too much into the details on these, but translation basically means the DNA strand unravels. Then it creates what's called a messenger RNA, which is another complex and long-chained protein. The messenger RNA then travels to a part of the cell, one of the little machines. It's called a ribosome. And the ribosome is the little chemical factory where amino acids start to come in, and they build in, and they form these long chains. They're called polypeptide chains. Those are proteins. So here we see in action, this is the ribosome. That's the protein power factory of our cells. Okay, that's where all the action's going on. So I think I'm going to show you a little video and see if it works. Excuse me. We're not hearing the narrator. I hear the music loud and clear. That's better. Sorry.
In 1957, Francis Crick first proposed that chemicals called bases along the spine of the DNA molecule function as alphabetic character.
There's a bad connection on the wire.
Animate shows how this digital information directs protein synthesis. First, a large protein complex separates the tightly wound strands of the DNA to prepare it to be copied. During this process of transcription, a protein complex called a polymerase produces a single-stranded copy of the original instructions. Here we see this copy, a messenger RNA molecule, being constructed inside the polymerase as individual bases are positioned and added to the growing strand. Now we see the polymerase in action from the outside as it spits out the messenger RNA transcript. Next, this RNA transcript approaches and passes through a molecular machine called the nuclear pore complex, an information recognition device that controls the flow of information in and out of the cell's nucleus. Now we see the genetic assembly instructions on the messenger RNA approaching and arriving at a 2-part chemical factory called a ribosome, the site of protein synthesis. As the messenger RNA transcript passes through the ribosome, the process of translation begins. During translation, a mechanical assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids in accord with the instructions on the transcript. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell by molecules called transfer RNAs, which link specific sequences of bases to corresponding amino acids. The sequential arrangement of the amino acids determines the type of protein constructed. When the construction of the chain is complete, it is transported to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape required to perform its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is released into the outer cytoplasm to do its job in the cell.
Okay. The video probably does a little bit better job of showing it than I could explain it to. One of the other characteristics of DNA is it's self-correcting. Okay, and what that means is that it can actually heal itself or correct imperfections in the code. It has these little editorial enzymes that travel up and down the helical backbone, and they find mistakes and they correct them. Okay, those enzymes need DNA to form, and the DNA need the enzymes. So you can kind of see a little bit of a problem there, right? They both had to be present in order for the system to function. Elaborate a little further on that point. So, proteins, okay, proteins help form DNA. DNA needs RNA, right, to function, and RNA needs proteins. So this is a closed loop system, right? What do I mean by that? I mean, basically, proteins require DNA, and DNA requires proteins. So which came first? I don't have a picture of a chicken or egg on here, but you kind of get the point, right? That's the analogies. Even proteins themselves, okay, require proteins in order to be synthesized. There are many different types of proteins. Some of them are called chaperone proteins, and they actually help take the proteins to where they need to be. You kind of saw them traveling around through the cell in the video. Those chaperone proteins need to be there. Okay, the last topic I'm going to touch on is information. Okay, and what is it? What is information? This is a book by a gentleman, Dr. Werner Gitt, and it's actually a pretty good read. He talks about information, and he talks about how God created information to design everything in nature, including you and I. Okay? The title of that book is In the Beginning Was Information. Another good book that I read doing research for this talk is Signature in the Cell. I think you saw it at the beginning of the video. They showed this book on there. This is another good one. Talks about DNA. There's a couple. Pardon me?
Light reading.
It's only 600 pages. Where was I going?
Sorry.
Information. There are a couple chapters in here devoted to information science. Information science is actually a new branch of science. Information is not matter. Information is not... Where's my... Oh, one of my props. Is this information? No. Not until we put something on it, right? Could be empty. Okay? And when we put information on it, it doesn't weigh any more, right, than an empty one. So what is the information? Well, it's not material. It's not matter. It's not energy. What about this laser pointer that I'm using to move my slides back and forth? Is this information? No, this is matter. However, when I push a button, it controls, it sends a signal to the computer, and it tells it, so it has information involved with it. Okay? It's not a material entity. Let me show you another little illustration. So I'm walking along the beach, and I take my stick and I write a message in the sand, right? Then I erase it, and then I go back and I go to the same spot and I write something different. Maybe I write happy birthday this time, right? I didn't change the matter. I used the same matter as before, right? But the information was different. Okay? Talk a little more about information. What does information do? Well, we know what information on a book or on a slide does, but what about biologically speaking? All of the systems in our bodies require information. They require storage, transfer, and interpretation in order for them to operate correctly, right? We saw that on the video. Here's some examples. This is a spider web, okay? So a spider, it's really actually a genius when you've seen a web constructed. It's a master architect. It's a chemist because it knows how to form the silk. It's a structural engineer, right? Because it knows what it needs to form. A web has two kinds of webs or threads. It has spiral threads and it has the radial ones that cut across them, right? And you might think that the spiral and the radial threads just come to a point like that, right? Well, that's not the case. If you look at where those intersect and you magnify it, so that's the little circle, and that's what this picture is showing you. They actually intersect in parallel for a certain distance, and then there are little tiny threads that kind of weld them together to give it an optimal design and structural integrity. Where did the spider obtain this specialized knowledge? The answer is that information plays an essential role. There's another example. This is a human embryo, and the wonders that occur during that 9 months gestation period are really unsurpassable. During the first 4 weeks of life, billions of cells are formed, starting with one cell, and they arrange themselves according to a fascinating plan to shape the new human being. Okay? So eventually we see the nervous system and the heart and the brain and the eye, right? Forming according to a precise plan. All of the stages are programmed in the finest detail. In this case also, information is the overall guiding factor. Okay? Information is required for all life processes. So it's a fundamental characteristic of life. According to evolutionists, everything's explained by chemistry and physics alone. And that's kind of where things fall apart for evolutionists, right? We need information. That's really what you won't find in your biology textbooks. Where does information come from? We see it in our newspapers, we see it on TV, we hear it on the radio daily, correct? And really, there's one important prerequisite. The first law of information science is information never originates by itself. And that means it requires a sender, okay? So information is always dependent upon the will of the sender, okay? I gave you the combination to the padlock, right? I was the sender of the information, okay? Some more kind of characteristics or prerequisites for information. These are 5 levels of information. All 5 of them need to be present in order for something to be considered information, according to information science. So, statistics. You got to have some kind of letter or code. The Latin alphabet, A, B, C, D. The Greek alphabet, alpha, beta, right? The DNA language, G, C, A, T, right? Hieroglyphics are symbols. Dots and dashes for Morse code. So the second level of information is syntax. It's kind of the manner in which your characters are organized. So you could have a binary code, right? In the case of DNA, what we have is a quaternary code, 4 letters arranged. Or you could have the alphabet, which is 27. The next level is semantics. Sorry. Semantics. The message being conveyed, the conclusions and the means. So you can't just have letters, you can't just have words, you got to have a message, right? They have to be organized. And then the next 2 levels are kind of the same. You have to have some meaning, some instruction, kind of like what we saw with DNA. And you got to have what's called apologetics, which is an actual plan for the information. What is the desired outcome? The desired outcome of the combination was so you could open the lock and use it. In the New Testament, John mentions the purpose for his information. I write these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, so that you may know that you have eternal life. So we conclude that some purpose is pursued wherever information is involved. Evolutionary believers say that there is no purposeful design or deliberate design. In the words of G.G. Simpson, an American zoologist, man is the result of a materialistic process having no purpose or intent. He represents the highest fortuitous organizational form of matter and energy. So accidental. According to him, he says we're accidents. So, many insist that the machinery of the first cell could have arisen by pure chance, right? If I put all the letters of the alphabet into a hat and I start pulling them out, I could eventually get a word, right? Like bat, B-A-T, right? What would the word bat mean to somebody who's German or Chinese? Nothing, right?
It does mean something in German.
Okay, but it would be something different. So we wouldn't be able to universally translate that information, would we? The point is, the order of the letters is meaningless unless there is a language convention, right? And a translation system in place that makes it meaningful, okay? We have that machinery in our cells. So the DNA translation machinery in our cells exists. Those are the machines we need, and if they're not fully formed at the beginning, life won't work. So I've got a few closing comments. Before I get to those, I want to ask, probably most of us have heard of Bill Nye, right? Remember his debate about a year ago with Ken Ham? Okay, that was exciting. He's obviously an atheist. One of the things that Bill Nye kind of came about in the news and declared recently, or within the last several months, that I found to be particularly hypocritical, was he bemoaned the low science scores of American students. Okay? He said that the blame is on the teaching of creation. Okay? But here's the problem with that. Students, by and large, have been taught evolution as a fact. They haven't been allowed to teach creation in schools, right? Most of the textbooks have presented evolution as a fact for many, many years. Okay? It's not the teaching of creation that is resulting in the poor science scores of our students. And really, it's quite sad that the media continues to mock biblical creationists whenever they have the opportunity. And one of the ways they do that is they spread false information about us and the nature of the debate, just like Bill Nye did. Unfortunately, that's the way it is. And it's not a surprise because this is a spiritual battle that we face, right? We need to remember to pray for those who refuse to acknowledge their Creator. And we need to be bold in standing for the truth of God's Word from the very beginning and sharing it with others. So the way I want to close here is, one of the ways I see this, and I hope you all agree with me, is there might be many theories on the origins of life, but ultimately there are only two choices. Okay? You are either for Christ or you are against Him. Matthew 12:30, whoever is not with me is against me. And whoever does not gather with me scatters. Okay? Let's not scatter. Okay? Share this information with your children, with your friends, with your family, with your coworkers, okay? Tell them the truth that you're seeing here. We are either acknowledging our Creator, Jesus Christ, as God and Lord, or we are ignoring the knowledge of God that He has put within all of us and made clear throughout creation. And God warned us in Romans 1:18, the wickedness of people, like Bill Nye, who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Okay? That's what we see. They're suppressing the truth. So as I had mentioned, a person either trusts God's Word or they trust man's word. And really, that's not a new battle. That battle began in Genesis 3, when the serpent tempted Eve. And he told her that if you eat this fruit, ye shall be as gods. Right? You shall be smarter than God. Or as smart as God. And that struggle hasn't stopped. and it will not stop until Christ's return and the final judgment. So, in the Bible, God has revealed to us that we are in rebellion against our Creator. And because of this rebellion called sin, our physical bodies are sentenced to death. But we will all live on. The good news is that our Creator provided, through the cross of Jesus Christ, a means of deliverance for our sin of rebellion, so that those who come to Him in faith, in repentance for their sin, can receive the forgiveness of a holy God and spend forever with their Lord. And that is very good. Thank you. Anybody want to, any questions or comments?
When was that scientist that he